Rabbi Julia Andelman here, Director of Community Engagement at JTS, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's session of our Living a Life of Meaning series. As you know, this series is exploring in response to the severe disruption to our normal lives, and for a lot of us, close encounters with mortality in recent months. We're exploring that through Torah study, exploring the role of values and ethics and our Jewish texts and wisdom in an attempt to evaluate what's truly important to us. So thank you for joining us today. If it's your first time joining, you can view other sessions using the link in the email that you received from Lynn Feynman earlier today. We're very pleased to have Professor Alan Cooper, Elaine Ravich, Professor of Jewish Studies in our Bible department, teaching us today. And the session is The Certainty of Uncertainty, meaning we know that uncertainty is a fact of life. I was thinking about this just in the last few minutes, because we have a new hope right now with the news of vaccines that seem to be coming, and yet I was listening to the daily podcast from the New York Times today. I don't know if many of you listen to that. Hopefully you do. But today's episode was exploring, even with this new vaccine on the horizon, just how much uncertainty there is. Will it be approved? Will other vaccines be approved? When will there be enough for everyone? Who will get it first? Will people come back for their second dose? All of that. So it still leaves us in a state of, so many questions about where all of us will be in, over the next several months. So for me, this session is especially timely today. I want to include one new announcement today, which I haven't included, which is under the heading of Ein Kemach, Ein Torah. In the words of the rabbis, if there's not flour, meaning if there's not resources, then there's not Torah. So I want to start by just thanking the many of you who have donated to support this series, which has really meant so much to us. We're thrilled by your enthusiastic participation and also by your financial support. We've been working with our development team, and we'd like to announce today a new opportunity to underwrite sessions of this series for $540 per session. And when we begin new series in the spring, we'll be announcing opportunities to underwrite an entire series. So we hope that you'll consider that opportunity, those who have the means, of course. If you're interested in that, you can send us an email at communitylearning@jtsa.edu, and hope some of you will be interested in helping us in that way. We're thrilled to offer so much learning to so many of you across North America and beyond, and hope for your partnership too in continuing to do that. Okay, on that long-winded note, I turn things over to Tani Schwartz-Herman to guide us through the next phase.
Thank you, Rabbi Andelman. Just to quickly go over the Q&A feature for the session. Dr. Cooper will pause periodically for questions throughout the class, and we will also have a Q&A period at the end. You can use the chat feature to submit your question to Rabbi Andelman. To open the chat, hover your cursor over the bottom of the Zoom screen and click on the chat icon. During the Q&A period, Julia will select a few of the questions to present to Dr. Cooper. Please note that you will only be able to chat with JTS staff. You will not be able to send messages to the group or to Dr. Cooper. For technical and logistical questions, please initiate a private chat with myself or with Lynn Feynman. For those of you who have called in only, you will unfortunately not be able to ask a question. Please consider joining via Zoom for future sessions. The sources for today's class were in the email that you received with the Zoom link for the session, and Dr. Cooper will also be screen sharing the sources. I'm pleased now to turn it over to Dr. Cooper.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Andelman, and thanks, Tani, for those kind introductions and good words. I was beginning to think that Tani was not going to unmute me and have not mastered American Sign Language. So it would have been difficult for me to communicate. Of course, most of you don't understand American Sign Language, so I could have said anything. I'd like to welcome you. Of course, what else is there to do if you're in the New York area on a miserable day like today, except to stay home and learn Torah? Then on the third hand, learning Torah is the best thing to be doing anyway, and that will probably figure into some of our discussion today. I also would like to offer just a bit of full disclosure, which is to say that the original version of the class that I'll be presenting today actually was prepared for a lesson on Yom Kippur afternoon at my synagogue, Congregation Bethel in South Orange. So if you sense that some of the content is skewed a bit towards high holiday themes, and particularly in the direction of helping us to understand some of the mysteries inherent in the book of Jonah, which of course we read on Yom Kippur afternoon, that would be a correct perception on your part. I actually did prepare it for that purpose. Nevertheless, I think that the theme of uncertainty in Jewish thought and Jewish theology, and in the way in which it impinges on our relationship with God, is always relevant. And that's going to lead us towards the end of our discussion to some words about what it means to trust God, the nature of trust. The bitachon is the Hebrew word. We'll be talking a bit about that because it's a concept, trust in God, that is A, fundamental to Judaism, and B, generally misunderstood. So what we'll try to do is to explore it a little bit in order to move in the direction of a proper understanding based on our sources. With that, I'd like to share the screen that has my texts and begin our discussion of those. And as Tani rightly said, what I intend to do is to pause at appropriate times during the presentation so that you have ample opportunity to comment and question. Our ground zero here is a famous passage that comes right towards the middle of the Book of Lamentations. You may know that Lamentations chapter 3 is a triple acrostic, which is to say that each letter of the Hebrew alphabet occurs 3 times at the beginning of 3 successive verses. And when we get to the Tet verse and the Yud verse, we have these famous statements that are here. Tov Adonai Lekovav. The Lord is good to those who trust in him, which is what we have in the JPS translation. But it's worth noting that the word kavah, the Hebrew root, which is reflected in a word that everybody here probably knows, tikvah, which is often translated hope, actually has a broader range of meanings than that. Lekavot doesn't just mean to hope, it also means to wait, and it also means to expect. And depending on which valence you assign to it, whether you think it means wait, that is to say to be patient, or hope, that is to say to have aspiration, or expect, that is to have some degree of certainty about what's coming, makes a big difference to how you interpret the term. So here, trust is the definition that's given, but it is immediately followed by a notion that the author of Lamentations intended to have something more to do with waiting patiently to one who seeks God. It is good to wait patiently, tov v'yachil v'dumam, till rescue comes from Adonai, till rescue comes from the Lord. And then comes this very strange statement about suffering in verse 27, which you can see there. Tov la gever ki yisa ol bin urav. It is good for a man, and generally I like gender-neutral translations, but in the context of Lamentations chapter 3, which begins with the statement, I am the man who has seen affliction, ani hagever, there is a kind of a warrior connection, a connotation of maleness that's hard to avoid. Nevertheless, the notion that the suffering that's been imposed on the speaker in this poem is somehow good for the speaker because he is bearing this yoke in youth is fascinating and interesting. Let him sit alone and be patient. Yeshev badad v'yidom, and you can see the same dumam there in verse 26 and yidom in verse 28, which has to do with patience and also has to do with silence. Keep your mouth shut. Don't be like Job, who's constantly complaining and inveighing about the injustice directed against him. Let him put his mouth to the dust. Ulai yesh tikva. And that word ulai is very important to me. Maybe there is hope. So you see how beautifully framed this little passage of the poem is, with Tov Adonai lekovav, a confident statement that God is good to those who are kovav, who hope, wait, expect. And then after just a few verses, maybe there is hope. Maybe there's reason for hope. And what's also interesting about this passage in Lamentations, which we could spend our whole time on, is that it comes in the context of a chapter that really is basically an expression of hopelessness. A person who's suffering miserably at the beginning of the chapter turns with this expression of potential hope, but then turns away from it later in the chapter with a notion that although he is ardently petitioning God, God is blocking out prayer and not listening. And it's not clear that God hears at all. So there's a kind of obliqueness and irony in this chapter, which is not often read into it by commentators who see it just on the flat as a counsel of patience in the midst of suffering. But it's patience and it's impatience and it's hope and it's calling out in prayer. And it's not really knowing what's going to happen, but putting one's faith in ulai, maybe. And we'll be talking a lot about maybe in this class. A second text, which is directly relevant to our theme, is a famous text from the life of King David. As punishment for King David's adulterous union with Bathsheba, with Bathsheba, the prophet Nathan announces that the first offspring of their relationship will die. It's an unequivocal prophecy, an oracle of judgment, a prophecy of doom. Ki nietz niatzta et oivei Adonai badavar hazeh, gam haben hayilod lecha mot yamut. There's nothing equivocal about it. Since you have spurned the enemies of the Lord, which most commentators, including ancient commentators, and certainly most modern commentators, take the phrase enemies of the Lord for being a euphemism, as a euphemism for God. In other words, you've spurned God, you've repudiated God in committing this heinous act of adultery, but that is mollified by the euphemism, and some commentators try to find a way of explaining it, but I'm not going to dwell on that point, except to say that the oracle of judgment against David is unequivocal. Haben hayilod lecha, this child with whom Bathsheba is pregnant is going to die. Despite the dire prophecy, when the child is born and becomes critically ill, David fasts and prays for the infant's life. As soon as the baby dies, David ceases his petitioning and almost immediately resumes his normal activities. I mean, there's nothing like kind of funerary rites or shiv'ah, the kinds of customs we associate with mourning, and gradual reintegration into more normal life. And this astonishes David's retinue. And he says, when he's questioned about it, while the child was still alive, I fasted and wept because I thought, and here's our key word, mi yodea, who knows? Now, what fascinates me is the dissonance between the unequivocal oracle of judgment, the child surely will die, and the mi yodea, who knows? That is to say, introducing equivocality and uncertainty into what looks completely certain in the original oracle. V'chanani Adonai, v'chai hayaled. The Lord may have pity on me. This is that word chanani, Ya'er Adonai panav elecha v'chuneka. May God be gracious unto you in the priestly blessing. But I often think that a better translation even there would be like the translation here. Take pity on you because, we're so weak and unworthy and we have to rely on God's mercy and pity in order to survive. So too, David throws himself upon God's mercy and says, V'chanani, maybe God, who knows, will relent, pity me, and the child might live. But now the kid's dead. Now that he's dead, why should I fast? Lama ze ani tzam. And when you say lama ze ani, it's emphatic. Really, if you'll pardon the expression, the way that should be translated is, why the hell should I fast? That extra pronoun puts that particular emphasis in there. And we have numerous cases of this in biblical interrogatives. So that's just something to keep in mind. He's actually pretty emphatic here. So I'm going, and then comes this very strange little statement. I'm going where he's going, but he's not coming back to me, which most people, I think, rightly take to mean that I'm going to join him in the realm of death, but he's not coming back to life. That child is not coming back to life. A kind of very straightforward existential statement about the situation. Our commentators have a lot to say about this, and I want to draw to your attention a couple of comments about the nature of trust, prayer, certainty, and uncertainty that come from the commentary of Levi ben Gershom. You can see he lived in France from 1288 to 1344, and he takes the occasion of a very interesting passage in 2 Samuel chapter 21 to enumerate lessons that may be derived from stories about David. He finds 68 of them. This is characteristic of Levi ben Gershom's commentaries throughout, that he derives practical lessons and teachings of various sorts, ethical, halachic, and so forth, from his interpretations of biblical texts. So there are two that come specifically from the text that we're talking about. Number 44. Aren't you glad I spared you the first 43? Who? Lahodia she'af al pi she'gazar Hashem yitbarach lahavi ra ma she'ein ra'ui la'adam milehimane lehitpalel lo. Even though God has decreed to bring about evil, it is unfitting for a person to refrain from praying to God, for God to remove that evil, because God is gracious and renouncing punishment. Chanun Hashem v'nichal al hara'ah, which is a language that comes up in the book of Jonah and elsewhere. And we'll see how that figures into this profound theology of uncertainty. Even though God had fated for David by means of his prophet Nathan, that the child would surely die, David did not refrain from praying, fasting, and lying on the ground, greatly abasing himself before God. And then comes our other key word, ulai, maybe God would be gracious to him and let the child live. Those are our key terms, ulai, maybe, open to the possibility of difference. Who knows? And that's an honest statement about how little we know about what God does and why God does it. So why not err on the side of uncertainty rather than mistake the notion of trusting in God to be an expression or an idea that we know positively what God will do, or I dare say must do, in each situation. Just because God has preached an oracle of destruction doesn't necessarily mean that destruction is going to take place. And we'll see that notion again and again in biblical literature. He brings a fascinating proof text. From this, we learn that when it says in the Torah, when you're at war in your land against an aggressor who attacks you, you shall sound short blasts on the trumpets, that you may be remembered before the Lord your God and be delivered from your enemies. What? Where does that come from? And how is that related to the story of King David and our theme of certainty and uncertainty? Well, first of all, if you look in the context in Numbers chapter 10, there's absolutely no mention of prayer and fasting there. The trumpets are sounded as a call to alarm with an attack imminent. But what Levi ben Gershom, Ralbag, is doing is assimilating these trumpet blasts to the blasts of the shofar, and to taking this to be much more than merely a call to battle, but also a call to the people with battle apparently imminent, to abase themselves in prayer and fasting and plead for God's aid and God's mercy with an enemy about to confront them. So the sound of the trumpets, according to Ralbag, is intended to inspire acts of penitence that evoke God's mercy. No matter how dire the situation may seem, there's nothing that should prevent you from pleading for God's mercy. V'rachameim v'hit palalame love, that God might have mercy on them for praying to him. Because it's this prayer, along with the trumpet blast, that occasions their being remembered by God. And that's an interesting take on why we sound the shofar on Yom Kippur, on the high holidays. It's not just to remind ourselves to return to God, but also to remind God to turn towards us. Number 45 in the Ralbag has to do with mitzvot, with commandments. And it has to do specifically with what the commandment to engage in prayer towards God entails. It teaches, he says, Ra'ui latzum ulhitpalel al hatzara achar shekvar higia. It is unfitting, it is ein ra'ui, unfitting to fast and pray about a hardship that already has come to pass. It's unfitting to pray for something that's impossible for God, except if it were a prophet praying and petitioning for a miracle. And you can see the reflection on David's remarks following the death of the baby. Now that he's dead, why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? And this also is related to the theme of the enemy aggressor in Numbers. We explain this in the Torah commentary from the fact that it says an aggressor who is attacking you, or who attacks you, or who is about to attack you, not one who's attacked already. Too late. You can't pray after the deed is done. I mean, you can do anything you like, but it's inappropriate, it's unfitting. So much for David and the lessons that we draw from David about praying in the face of uncertainty, even in the face of an oracle of judgment. Next text, and after this one, I'll stop for questions and comments. This comes from the book of Esther, where we have our next who knows. Esther expresses her fear that she'll be executed if she enters the king's presence unsummoned, and Mordecai remonstrates with her in this famous passage in Esther chapter 4, verses 13 and following. And here highlighted are the key words, but we'll look at this in English for a very particular reason, which is to say, in order to look at some crucial differences between the Hebrew version of Esther and one of the Greek versions of Esther, which transforms the message of the Hebrew text into a much more explicitly religious teaching. So Mordecai, had this message delivered to Esther. Don't imagine that you, of all the Jews, will escape with your life by being in the king's palace. On the contrary, if you keep silent in this crisis, relief and deliverance will come to the Jews from another quarter, while you and your father's house will perish. That's a very strange way of putting it, especially without any mention of deity, or with this oblique reference to where salvation or rescue is likely to come from if it doesn't come from Esther. And it shows a peculiar interest in keeping God explicitly out of the Hebrew book of Esther. Not so in the Greek version. If you ignore your nation and do not help them, then surely God will be to them a helper and a deliverance, but you and your father's household will perish. So it's about you. It's about whether you're willing to stand up and take responsibility as spokesperson for your nation when it's in duress. One way or another, God is going to save the Jewish people. But when you have the opportunity to have it be by your means, and God forbid you fail to take advantage of that opportunity, it's not going to go well with you. So you can see the message to Esther from Mordecai is quite different in the Greek version than it is in the Esther version. And then comes the expression of uncertainty. Is this all on account of God's will? Who knows if for this time you were made queen? Well, of course, in the Greek version, it's clear that this must be part of a divine plan because God has just been mentioned. The Hebrew retains its ambiguity. Who knows if you've attained to royal position for just such a crisis? And then the response shows also the crucial difference between the Hebrew and Greek versions when Esther summons the Jews in Shushan to fast in my behalf. Don't eat or drink for 3 days, night or day, and I and my maidens will observe the same fast. What? This is like, pray for me, but no. The Greek version has it, proclaim a religious service, petition God earnestly. Just as in Numbers, you don't blow the shofar just to muster the troops. You blow the shofar in order to muster the people in prayer and beseeching God for aid. So also in the Greek version of Esther. This fasting and prayer is not in Esther's behalf, but it's in order to evoke divine aid. So the religious message that may or may not be implicit in Esther, where it looks so much like it's about self-help, is explicit, the religious message, here in the Greek version. Okay, so that's our second text. And with that, I think I'd like to take a pause and see if there is something in the chat that we would like to address. Are there any questions that have been put to Lynn and Tani?
We have a whole bunch of questions have come in for you, all in the last 3 minutes. So I'm trying to sort through them all. But this is kind of a fundamental question in terms of how we're defining uncertainty and making sure we're all on the same page. So Michael Miller was asking, why are the expressions of uncertainty that Dr. Cooper is referencing not just demonstrations of a lack of faith, or are these the same thing? Put another way, aren't they just hedging their bets?
That's a brilliant question. And of course, one could say that it goes either way. And that's one of the reasons that I made that comment about the Hebrew root kavah, hope, wait, expect, right? Is the hope contrary to expectation, or is the hope actually contained within an expectation? And the relationship between trust and certainty is exactly the direction we're heading in as we move towards our theological statements about certainty. But I think what Michael has done is he's raised precisely the question, I was about to say, the uncertainty that's inherent in what we're having of our discussion today. And I think it's a very astute observation. My view, not to be leading with my chin, is that uncertainty is the only appropriate attitude to take in relation to God as a way of reflecting our utter lack of knowledge, our lack of knowledge as opposed to hope and belief with respect to what God is going to do or not do in a given situation. We'll get there. Thank you.
Okay, Professor Cooper, I have so many questions, all in different ways, of kind of boiling down to the same thing, which is about praying and hoping and asking for something that's a fait accompli, whether it's whether it's a Misha Berach for someone who clearly has a terminal illness, or an earthly, other kind of earthly fate that's been decreed. Several, actually citing other biblical events also, and how do we know when a decree is not fully a decree? One questioner asks about Jonah and Nineveh. So, the decree for David here is clear, but it wasn't necessarily for Jonah. So, do we even know when something's a definite decree? But a lot of questions about petitioning for something where it seems impossible, and how does that fit into to what you're talking about, the theology that you're talking about?
Well, the first thing you have to accept is your absolute ignorance. You don't know, and you don't know what you don't know. And even when you think you know something, you don't know if you've interpreted or understood it correctly, or interpreted it correctly in relation to yourself, in relation to your life. And thus these prophetic decrees. And you can see them in one text after another. Possibly the most famous example, and one that people will be familiar with from just having the last couple of weeks of Torah readings, is the ambiguity of the oracle to Rebecca when she has the twins jostling in her womb. And the oracle couldn't be clearer. It says, among other things, V'rav ya'avod tza'ir, which means the greater shall serve the younger. First of all, I don't understand the relationship between the words Rav and Sa'ir, which are not a symmetrical pair. Second of all, I don't know what the subject of that sentence is, and what's the object. I don't know if it says the greater shall serve the younger, or the younger shall serve the greater, because I don't know which is the subject and which is the object. But Rebecca knows when she hears it, she knows that it means the elder shall serve the younger. And she knows that Jacob is the younger son, and that therefore Jacob is the one who is destined for ascendancy, and that therefore she should intervene on behalf of Jacob at every opportunity in order to ensure Jacob's ascendancy, even though, number one, it's not clear that the oracle means that at all. And number two, it's not clear how the oracle inspires that particular course of action upon which she embarks, which arguably causes nothing but trouble for Jacob and Esau and everybody else in the family. You see my point? My point is that we have naturalized what that oracle means, and we therefore put ourselves in the position that Rebecca actually is in when she hears the oracle. Oh gosh, I've just gotten this word from God. I understand it perfectly. I understand it lucidly. I know how it directs me on a course of action. And the answer in every case is no, you may not have heard it clearly. You may not have interpreted it correctly. And even if you did interpret it correctly, it doesn't necessarily dictate one course of action as opposed to another. So that acknowledging ambiguity that's inherent in all things, acknowledging ignorance, lack of knowledge, imperfect ability to interpret what one hears is at the very essence of belief. And there has to be some form of confidence, some form of trust in God. But trust in God is not the same as trust in yourself. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about our abilities to hear and interpret and know. So that is why uncertainty is built so firmly into the system, including, I think, the author's rebuke of Jonah at the end, which is, you were so sure, you were so cocksure that you took this course of action that led you to flee in the first place and led you to get angry in the second place. And all you were doing is demonstrating your ignorance of God's intention. So there you go. I hope that's a sufficient answer. That may be the whole class.
I think it was a sufficient answer. Do you want to take one more?
No, I think we'll continue if that's all right with you.
Okay.
And we'll try to leave time. So when we come to the prophet Jeremiah, we have a couple of kind of contradictory statements about this theme of divine action in relation to oracle, in relation to prophetic prediction. And the one that I want to dwell on particularly is in chapter 18 here, which also is tied to a high holiday theme, when we describe ourselves as clay in the hands of the potter. That is simply evoking an image that's very well known from the book of Jeremiah. Hinei kachomer biyad hayotzer kenatem biyadi beit Yisrael. And you can think about all sorts of ways to interpreting the metaphor of clay in the hands of the potter. So just like clay in the hands of the potter, so are you in my hands, O house of Israel. At one moment I may decree that a nation or kingdom shall be uprooted and pulled down and destroyed. But if that nation against which I made the decree turns back from its wickedness, I change my mind concerning the punishment I plan to bring on it. In another moment I may decree that a nation or a kingdom shall be built and planted. But if it does what is displeasing to me and does not obey me, then I change my mind concerning the good I planned to bestow upon it. Well, the good news is that it places God in control of everyone's destiny. The bad news is the way it leaves God absolutely free to do as God pleases in relation to human behavior. And you can look at the Hebrew here. V'nichamti al hatovah, v'nichamti al hara'ah. So again, this is the same language, anticipating the Hebrew of the book of Jonah, when Jonah describes God as characteristically someone who is nicham al hara'ah, relenting with respect to evil. And indeed, the rabbinic and post-rabbinic tradition wants us to eat our cake and have it too, by saying that God is always ready to falsify an oracle of destruction in response to prayer and penitence, but not to reverse an oracle for good, despite what it says here in Jeremiah chapter 18. Moving farther along in the book of Joel, chapter 2, verses 1 through 11, not on everybody's everyday study list, we have one of the vivid depictions in this oracle in Joel chapter 2 of what's called the Day of the Lord, which is the day of the Holy War, which is a war of judgment. In the early Holy War traditions, it would have been a judgment against Israel's enemies, but in these later oracles of judgment, beginning with the book of Amos, and here also in the book of Joel, the Day of the Lord is refigured as a day of judgment against the sins of Israel. When, as punishment for sin, the divine warrior and the divine warrior's troops will turn the land from a veritable Garden of Eden into a desolate waste. This chapter, Joel chapter 2, is very much worth your time as one of the most powerful oracles of judgment that we have. But then, after announcing this oracle of desolation, the prophet declares, Gamata, even now, Ne'um Adonai, an oracle of Adonai, Shuvu Adai, repent, return to me, wholeheartedly, b'chol levavchem, like in the Shema, uvetzom, uvivchi, uvemisped, with hearts and fasting, with all your hearts and fasting and weeping and lamenting. Kir'u levavchem, tear up your hearts, rather than your garments, and turn back to the Lord your God. Why? Because here we have an evocation of the divine attributes that we repeat again and again and again during the high holy days, with the emendation that's already been signaled in the book of Jeremiah, that's going to be restated in the book of Jonah. Chanun v'rachumhu, God is gracious and compassionate, shows pity and mercy. Erech hapayim v'rav chesed, slow to anger, full of love, v'nicham al hara'ah, renouncing punishment. Are we sure of that? Mi yodea. But even so, even given the apparent promise of Jeremiah, even given the admonition here that up to the last minute it's possible to repent and be saved, mi yodea, who knows? But he may turn, yashuv v'nicham, v'yish'ir acharav bracha, that instead of curse and destruction, who knows, he may turn and relent and leave a blessing behind for meal offering and drink offering to Lord your God. In other words, an opening for continuing worship of God in a proper sense. In the next verse, in chapter 2, verse 15 in Joel, the prophet calls upon Israel to blow a shofar in Zion, solemnize a fast, proclaim an assembly in order to plead for divine compassion. Now, there's no festival connection explicit anywhere in the book of Joel, but I hope you can appreciate how our commentators naturally would take that to refer to the high holy days and to adapt it for purposes of high holiday penance, repentance leading to God's favorable looking upon us. And that brings us to Jonah. In Jonah chapter 3, verses 4 through 10, the uncertainty inherent in what sounds like an unequivocal oracle of judgment motivates the Ninevites to act. They seem to be acting out the scenario depicted in Joel chapter 2. And I put that in a kind of modest way because I don't think they seem to be acting it out. I think they've actually have narrativized the scenario in Joel 2. I think this is actually a story that is intended explicitly to work out the scenario. And how do you do it? You do it by taking the worst people in the world and show them repenting in order to demonstrate that even if the worst people in the world are condemned, they still have that last minute opportunity to turn to God and repent and yet be saved. The salvation of the Ninevites is an equivocal thing, which I may mention in a little bit, but let's just look at the way the story works itself out. So Vayachel Yonah labo va'ir mahalach yom echad. So Jonah has gone through all these vicissitudes. I mean, this poor guy's been buffeted by this terrible storm, and he's been tossed into the sea, and he's been swallowed up by a great fish, and he's been vomited out by the great fish. And then he finally embarks on the mission for which he's been commissioned. Takes him one day, he goes one day, sets 1 foot into the city, and he cries out and he says, Od arba'im yom v'ninveh nepachet. That's it. That's the whole oracle. Another 40 days and Nineveh will be turned upside down. Now, you could take this reversal or turning upside down or turning a thing into its opposite to mean one of two things. Either it's going to be overthrown or it's going to be completely reversed. In other words, its evil ways will be transformed into something good so that they might be saved. How do you interpret that word? I mean, the ambiguity is self-evident in the word nehepache, which just means to turn a thing into its opposite. But what's the thing that's being turned into its opposite? Is it Nineveh's behavior, or is it the divine oracle of judgment, which could be turned into an oracle that's favorable to Nineveh? It's just like with Rebecca. You've got a word, you've got to interpret it, you've got to decide how to act on the basis of your interpretation. Well, here's what the Ninevites do. Vaya'aminu anshe Nineveh be'Elohim. They believe in God, they believe the oracle, and they interpret it to mean that they better turn around their evil ways in order to have some chance of avoiding destruction. And they call for a fast, Tzom, Vayilbashu Sakim, they put on sackcloth from the eldest to the youngest. And then the word is brought to the king of Nineveh, and I think we'll go to the English here. And he rose from his throne, took off his robe, put on sackcloth, sat in ashes. You can hear the resonances of this in mourning rites in the story of Job when he's in the midst of his suffering and so forth. He had word cried out through Nineveh. No man or beast, a flock or herd shall taste anything. Even the animals have to fast. This is an incredible bit of hyperbole that has all sorts of resonances with notions about animal responsibility or about what a lot of the book of Jonah is doing, which is to turning metaphor into a literal story. In other words, you have a hyperbolic statement as you have in the book of Joel. Even the beasts of the field cry out to you, says Joel. So let's have the beasts of the field cry out to God by making them fast and repent along with the human beings, just as when Jonah cries out in Jonah chapter 2, saying, I cried out from the belly of Sheol, the belly of the netherworld, and the author of the book of Jonah turns the belly of the netherworld literally into the belly of a great fish, which is a terrific source of humor. They shall not graze, they shall not drink water. They shall be covered with sackcloth. They shall cry mightily to God. Let everyone turn back from his evil ways, from the injustice of which he is guilty. Now we'll go back to the Hebrew, take a look at that. Yashuvu, ish midarko hara'a umin hechamas. Hamas, violence, evil. That's the pretext for God to destroy the world by flood. In the Noah story in Genesis chapter 6. The world is filled with this stuff and God floods it in order to wipe out all human beings except for Jonah and his family. Mi yodea, there's our word. Who knows? Yashuv v'nicham, God will relent. V'shav mecharon apo, will turn away from his fierce anger so that we might not be destroyed. Vayar ha'Elohim et ma'asehem ki shavu, midarkam hara'ah. Vayinachem ha'Elohim al hara'ah asher diber la'asod lahem. So God observes their actions, observes that they have turned away from their evil way, and God relents. Now, this little vav here at Vayinachem is interesting because, most people are inclined when they see chronological statements to also interpret them as statements of cause and effect. So you could interpret this to mean God saw what they had done, that they had turned away from their evil, and for that reason, God relented and did not execute the evil that was decreed against them. Or you could just simply say, God saw one thing and God did another. It's not a necessary relationship between cause and effect, but it is a possible one. So here we see how it's translated by JPS. God saw what they did, how they were turning back from their evil ways, and God renounced the punishment he had planned to bring upon them and did not carry it out. Now, keep in the back of your mind the fact that the Ninevites stand for the Assyrians, that the Assyrians were the agents of God's destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel, and that the Book of Nachum, which comes just a couple of books after the Book of Jonah in the collection of the 12 prophets, describes the destruction of the Assyrians. So the Assyrians are allowed by God to hang around long enough to be the agents of Israel's destruction, and then the Assyrians themselves get wiped out. So this momentary salvation of the Assyrians is just that, momentary, and it may even have a dark side in relation to whatever God's plan for Israel's future might be. In Jonah chapter 4, verses 1 through 3, the prophet is profoundly disturbed by what's tantamount to the falsification of his oracle. Now we have to juxtapose this kind of dizzying certainty on Jonah's part with the uncertainty that had motivated him to flee from his prophetic mission. Now, are we saying that the Ninevites' theology is superior to Jonah's? Jonah trusts that an oracle of judgment that he renders against the inhabitants of Nineveh should come true. Is Jonah misguided in thinking that? Well, it depends what kind of prophet you think he is. In Deuteronomy, we're taught that a prophet whose prophecy fails to come to pass is a prophecy who ought to be put to death. So Jonah, fleeing that fate at the beginning of the book, may have known all along that God was going to relent. That's what he says here in chapter 4. And thus it's his certainty that God will not relent because he's delivering this oracle of judgment that leads Jonah to flee for his life, among other things. So Jonah doesn't want to become a false prophet, and he has prophetic knowledge that his prophecy well might be falsified. But he doesn't express any uncertainty about it. He doesn't leave himself open to the possibility of Ninevite repentance reversing God's decree. And of course, we've adapted that mentality for the most part in the way in which we use the book of Jonah on Yom Kippur, which is to say that we adopt this notion of uncertainty for the sake of enabling ourselves to feel more certain that our prayer and repentance will cause God to keep us around for another year. And despite our general unworthiness, our confessions and prayer will restore us to God's favor. So Jonah now expresses himself. This displeased Jonah greatly, and he was grieved. he prayed to the Lord, saying, "O Lord, isn't this just what I said when I was still in my own country? That is why I fled beforehand to Tarshish. For I know," he doesn't say who knows, "I know that you're a compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in kindness, renouncing punishment. Please, Lord, take my life, for I would rather die than live." So this is very disorienting, and I think it's supposed to be, because the book of Jonah ends with Jonah in this miserable state. And of course, you can understand where a very hostile interpretation of the book of Jonah might have arisen out of Jonah's attitude here, namely this idea that this Hebrew prophet begrudges the Gentiles, the Ninevites, the opportunity for repentance. But of course, it's not about that at all. It's not about self and other. It's not about Israel versus the nations. It's about these competing theologies, a theology of certainty as opposed to a theology of who knows that relies on God's love and God's mercy and God's pity, even up till the last moment. I think with that, I'd like to stop for another batch of questions and comments. So Rabbi Andelman.
Great. We've gotten a few questions about the phenomenon of God changing God's mind. I think 4. I'm going to read you a few of them. I liked the way Betsy Chevy put it. If God is whimsical in relation to humans, why trust her? Or Eric Forster notes that the Jeremiah verse implies that God may change God's intent based on unexpected events. Does that put a limitation on God? Or Shelley was asking, the potential for God to relent seems to be tied to action on the part of humans, praying, fasting, returning, versus random changing of God's mind. What does that tell us? So and there are even more. So there's interest in hearing you speak more about the idea of God changing God's mind and how we should relate to that in terms of our uncertainty or the way we think about God and God's power.
Well, those are fantastic questions. And first of all, why trust if God is mercurial and changeable? Part of the answer goes back to the answer I gave previously about our ignorance. In other words, respecting that what we think we know may simply be a manifestation of overconfidence and ignorance, but also, and this will be the last part of our class, we have to define what we understand by the concept of trust. And it needs to be more sophisticated than a notion that trust in God connotes certainty. See the heading on the next section of our presentation? Trust is not equal to certainty. Or it means certainty about some things, but not other things, might be a more subtle way of putting it. So it's a great question, and I do hope that we come to it this afternoon. Limitation, that is another fabulous issue, another fabulous theological question. And of course, the locus classicus for discussion of God's limits placed on God's behavior would be the contrast between God's interaction with Noah and God's interaction with Abraham, which gets a lot of discussion in traditional literature and modern literature as well. God announces the destruction of the world in the Noah story and says, Noah, I'm commissioning you to save yourself and your family. Noah doesn't say a word, and God goes ahead with the destruction of the world. End of story, right? And then we get this new beginning, in which all evil has been eliminated from the world, which is why the world is so perfect now, right? It's a very mysterious story, the story of Noah. But at the very least, I think it's fair to say that there's no limitation placed on divine action. There's no effort to impose any limits on God's actions on the part of the human participants in the story. God announces destruction and goes ahead and destroys. When we come to the story of Abraham, in the encounter between God and Abraham over the fate of the inhabitants of Sodom and Amorah, Sodom and Gomorrah, we see something quite different. We see Abraham bartering with God. First of all, we see God announcing that God is willing to confide in a human being in order to announce God's intentions, which seems to be God's way of opening up the possibility of conversation, i.e., it would dare say, even negotiation. How fascinating is that? So there's a condescension on God's part to Abraham that we don't see any evidence of in the Noah story, and it seems to reflect a changing attitude on God's part about how to enter into relationship with human beings. That gets to the third question that you raised about the relationship between human behavior and divine response to human behavior, but we'll come to that in a moment. So Abraham barters and says, you know, if there's X many inhabitants who are righteous, will you not destroy the city? And if there's fewer and fewer and fewer, will you not destroy the city? And Abraham, you know, addresses one of the biggies in biblical literature by saying, shall not the judge of all the earth do justly or do right? And I don't want to unpack those terms now. All I want to do is leave that quote out in the air, out in the open, and say, how should God respond to that? I mean, if I were God, which thank God I'm not, I would say, who the hell are you to tell me what limitations I have to place on myself? In other words, who said that one of my principles in interacting with human beings is that I'm supposed to reward them if they're righteous and punish them if they're wicked, and then relent with respect to punishment of the collective if there's a 1 or 2 or 10 or 20 or 50 righteous people in their midst? I mean, who said? Who are you, human beings, to place limitations on divine behavior? So the self-limitation of God in dialogue with humanity, in negotiation with Abraham, which is mythicized, it turned into this story of the single encounter between God and Moses. And it happens again with God and Abraham, but it happens again with Moses. That's why I had Moses on the tip of my brain. When God threatens to destroy all of Israel, and Moses says, whoa, 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 what will the Egyptians think? Which is an incredible, audacious statement. You know, it will seem as if he didn't have the power to save Israel after all. Appeal to God's vanity, but come on. What we have is not a dialogue about the specifics, but a dialogue that takes us in theological terms in the direction of God's gracious condescension towards us, respectful of our humanity, and being willing to work with us as human beings in order to help us serve as God's partners in creating a better world without wiping us out for all of our inevitable wrongdoing. So that condescension yields a self-limitation on God's part that is an act of grace towards the world on the part of God, lest we see the world destroyed again as it was in response to the evil in the days of Noah. And finally, the question about theurgy, I think we've already gone in that direction, that it's God's most important decision to enter into relationship with humankind in this way, to create covenant, to create the possibility of dialogue, and yet somehow to remain transcendent and above the details of covenant and dialogue, and even the stipulations of the covenant may be subverted for the sake of God's love and God's mercy, just as God had announced to Abraham in response to one of the most famous midrashim about Abraham. Abraham does his horoscope and finds out that he's destined to be childless, and God basically says to Abraham, you know, astrology is all well and good, but remember who created the heavenly bodies. That's God. And God can subvert the dictates of astrology for the sake of those who trust in God. So the ongoing relationship in which human behavior, human words, human prayers, human actions can affect God's interaction with the world, it becomes the sine qua non of the Kabbalah, of the idea of a flow of energy that's constantly going back and forth between human action and divine response to human action, in a kind of continuous loop of power and energy, hopefully for good, but sometimes, unfortunately, for evil. And the seeds of that are biblical. I think, shall we move on?
Yeah, maybe just as a segue, not for you to answer, but there are a couple of questions that I think are the perfect segue to what you're about to talk about. And I thought they were nicely put. Are you, can I share those with you?
Yes, by all means. Thank you.
So, so Josh Freiberg wrote, certainty could be associated with arrogance and uncertainty with humility. So then how could one explain trust in God with humility? And then Sherry Allen was writing about her work as a hospital chaplain. And she said, it seems to me that for many Christians, trust does equal certainty. The phrase, I'm giving it up to God, is used a lot, meaning that whatever happens to them, it is absolutely God's will, and they are certain that it is right and true. So maybe that's a segue to your next section. Trust does not equal certainty.
Well, thanks. It certainly is. And thank you for those wonderful questions. This is a kind of a scary group. It's not only large, but also really smart. And your questions are absolutely on point and are helping to direct the conversation, I hope, in a positive way. I wish we had time to spend a lot of our energy on Avraham Maimonides, Avraham ben Harambam. He's often referred to as Abraham Maimuni, and he's Rambam's son. You can see his dates. He was a very prominent figure in Egypt in the early 13th century, unfortunately short-lived. And this comes from his Arabic treatise, which is called the Kitab Kifaya al-Abidin, Sufficient God, Sefer Hamaspik L'Ovdei Hashem is the way it's translated into Hebrew, sufficient for servants of God. And what we have here is a very lengthy chapter on the concept of trust, a bitachon. The Arabic term for this is tawakkul. It's a fundamental tenet of Muslim theology, and it's the Muslim concepts that are adapted by Jewish authors living in the Muslim world, most especially, most famously, by Bachya ibn Pakuda in a book that most of you probably at least have heard of, The Duties of the Heart, which is readily available in Hebrew and in English translation, which has a very lengthy chapter on trust. But since this particular source, which is quite similar to Bachya ibn Pakuda, is not so readily available, I thought I would share a bit of it with you. This is a kind of peculiar side note from a translation by Samuel Rosenblatt, who was a great scholar of Judeo-Arabic literature and philosophy, who lived in the first part of the 20th century. And he was the son of none other than Yossele Rosenblatt, possibly the greatest of all the Golden Age cantors. So from cantor to rabbi, he was a rabbi in Baltimore and was associated with Johns Hopkins University, and also a great expert on Judeo-Arabic texts, and particularly well known for his edition and translation of this book of Abraham Maimonides. So, trust in God is among the elevated paths, one of the fundamental principles of the law. And this could have he could be directly quoting a Muslim or even a Sufi source. No adherent of the law would deny its obligatory character. The essence of faith consists in the belief that God is the creator and provider, the one who gives life and brings death, makes sick and heals, makes rich and poor. Everything that happens in the world, in general and in particular, reverts to God. God is the author who decrees and executes everything except for the matter of obedience and disobedience. Okay, so here's the famous statement from Brachot which you probably all know, everything is in the hand of heaven except the fear of heaven. In other words, the starting point for trust in God is the premise that everything comes from God. And this makes perfect sense in theological terms in ways that would require a considerable, lengthy explanation for me to expound. So just let's leave it at that. Does that mean that bad things don't happen? Of course, bad things happen. Does it mean that there's a simplistic cause and effect relationship between what people do and what God does in response to what people do? No, it absolutely does not mean that. It just means that everything ultimately comes from God. But in order to use that as a premise for faith, we also have to accept the second premise, which is our absolute ignorance of what it is that God does and why God does it. Although we may have certain beliefs and we may create certain religious doctrines, and we may create beautiful poetic metaphors about what God does, like in our Hallelujah Psalms that talk about all of the wonders of God in creation. Those are poems. They're not reality. They're not theological treatises, and they're not based on any kind of empirical knowledge. They're metaphysical, poetic texts. And this is one of the things we learn from especially the books of Job and Ecclesiastes. Don't mistake poetry for reality. Don't mistake beauty for the way things really are. So God makes sick and heals, makes rich and poor. Why? Because God is God. Everything that happens reverts to God. So Maimoni at great length, which you owe me a big favor here for reducing this to a paragraph. Maimoni describes three kinds of trust in times of crisis. One, and this is paraphrase, not translation. Hope for a miracle, which is amply attested in Scripture, but is presumptuous and misguided in the absence of authentic prophecy. And you can see this, in the contrast between the story we've already discussed about David and his praying for the life of his baby in spite of the oracle predicting the baby's doom, as opposed to say the woman whose son is revived by the prophet Elijah, who is a prophet and a magic man and a wonder worker, who performs this extraordinary miracle, presumably with divine aid. So hoping for a miracle against everything scientific and natural and empirical in the absence of a genuine miracle worker like in Elijah is presumptuous and misguided. And particularly since, of course, in the Jewish tradition, that kind of prophecy has long since ceased. It ceased with the exile, or it ceased with whenever you deem the end of prophecy to have been, certainly by the end of the book of Malachi. So that's number one. That's contrary to possibility in our modern world. Number two, and it was contrary to possibility in Maimoni's world, reliance solely on, quote, proximate external ordinary means rather than God, which is characteristic of unbelievers and the wicked. In other words, when you get sick and you take your medicine, then it's the medicine that heals you. It has nothing to do with God. It's purely by natural means, and that there's a kind of a separate nature or a separate scientific realm that is distinguishable from anything that has to do with religion, anything that has to do with theology, anything that has to do with God. That's unbelief. That's heresy. 3, taking ordinary measures to ensure one's welfare while recognizing that their efficacy is dependent on God. This third kind of trust is, quote, obligatory upon all adherents of the world. And now, and I mean, the reason I'm not giving any of this to you in Hebrew, I should have made clear, is that there is no medieval Hebrew translation of this. There is no source for traditional Jewish readers who did not have Arabic to have access to this text until the modern period. And now, of course, there's a translation that's readily available that you can buy in a pious bookstore. Natural causes and ordinary means are disposed in accordance with the particular will of God with respect to every person at every time in every situation. So, does medicine work? Yeah, it works as long as it's the will of God that it works. So in other words, don't separate the realm of natural science, the realm of medicine, from the possibility that God may in some unfathomable way intervene in the efficacy of what looks to you to be purely natural. So God may allow natural means like good nutrition. Does everybody who runs, 3 miles a day manage to live to great old age? No. Why not? Is it purely because of natural means? Is it purely genetic? Is it purely medical, scientific? Well, you may take it that way, but according to Maimoni, you would be an unbeliever. Has something to do with God. What does it have to do with God? Is it because the guy who dies at 30 has been a wicked person and the guy who lives to 90 has been exceptionally good? No, it doesn't mean that. It means you just don't know. But God has something to do with it. And that's what you're supposed to trust in, according to this idea. God may allow natural means to attain their natural result or cause them to depart from their natural course. How many times have you heard about smokers who live into their 90s? No, what's the key to your old age? Well, I have a good cigar every day. So you just don't know. So that's Maimoni. And in case you think that's old-fashioned, let's take a look at a 20th century source, the Hazonish, one of the pillars of neo-Orthodoxy, of the Orthodox world. And I have to confess that one of the reasons that I brought this particular text is because I was thinking about it a lot in relationship to the response of some Haredim, some ultra-Orthodox Jews, to the pandemic, and the attitude that they should continue to send kids to crowded basement yeshivas because while they're studying Torah, no harm could possibly befall them, struck me as not only idiotic from a medical scientific point of view, but also contrary to the authentic Jewish tradition about what it means to have faith and trust in God. It's not that God is going to be sure to rescue you when you do something stupid. It's that there's always the possibility that if you take care of yourself, God is likely to take care of you as well. In other words, you're not exempt from taking proper care of yourself and placing your hands passively placing yourself passively in the hands of God, as if that's all you need to do in order to survive, or that somehow studying Torah gives you a 100% guarantee that you can't catch a virus. Ta'ut noshenet nit azracha belev rabim b'musag bitachon. Hebrew is not easy at the Hazonish. A venerable error has been instilled in the hearts of many with respect to the concept of trust. Shem bitachon, the noun trust, hamishamesh limida mehulala ve'ikarit b'fia chasidim. Trust is used by the pious to designate a praiseworthy and fundamental attribute, just like Maimoni 800 years before, has come to connote the obligation to believe in all circumstances in which people confront an uncertain future with two directions, one good but not the other. Surely the outcome will be good. Choval ha'amin. Ki betach yeh hatov, will certainly be good. And im mistapek v'choshesh al hipuch hatov, remember the use of nepachet in the book of Jonah to be something reversed from what's expected. If one worries about the opposite of the good one or the reversal of the good one, hu michusar bitachon, deficient trust. So it's all good. That's what you have to believe in order to embody the principle of trust in God. That's wrong. And this is not me talking. This is one of the leading ultra-Orthodox authorities of our time. Ein hora'ah zo b'vitachon nechona. This teaching about trust is incorrect. Kol shelo nitbarer binvuah goral ha'atid ein ha'atid mukhra. Whenever future destiny is not made explicit by prophecy, the future is undecided. For who knows? Oh, there's our old friend. Mi yodea mishpatei Hashem ugmolotav yitbarach. So this is a typical Jewish eating your cake and having it too. You have a firm prophecy, but that's immediately modified by the Mi yodea. Whenever future destiny is not made explicit by prophecy. I don't know why he says that, even when it is, according to biblical teaching. The future, ein ha'atid mukhra. So in other words, when somebody says authentically, it's God's will, that's still open to the possibility of uncertainty because we don't know what God's will is. So the combination of certainty about uncertainty and the concession to one's own ignorance is what are fundamental here. Who knows what God's judgments and requitals? The meaning of trust is the belief that there is no chance in the world, that everything that happens under the sun is by divine decree. That's worth looking at in Hebrew. Inyan habitachon, inyan in its medieval sense of meaning, hu ha'emun, it's the belief, she'ein mikra ba'olam, there's no chance. V'chol ha'na'aseh tachat hashamesh, hakol b'hachraza meito yitbarach. Everything that happens in the world under the sun is just a metaphor. It goes back to Phoenician, actually. That means in the world in which we live. There's a world that's not under the sun, but that has to do with mystical belief. So when a person encounters an occurrence, in which fear-inducing danger might naturally be expected, that's what we're in now, and depression weakens his recollection that chance does not lord over us, for there's no impediment to God rescuing him by reversing the course of events. At that difficult moment, he must internalize the well-known truth, namely, no harm comes about by chance. Not that you can't be harmed, but that if you are, it's as a result of some unfathomable scheme of things that comes from God, that's in God's power, that you have no choice but to accede to, but that you should also concede your ignorance of. The root of one's faith, which is the certainty that everything comes from God, should cancel out fear, is what he says. Let me see, I want to find this. And encourage belief in the possibility of rescue. For the proclivity for a bad outcome is not greater than for a good one. And that's what's called the attribute of trust. Asher shoresh emunato mifiga pachdato. So it annuls, it cancels out your fear. The root of faith, which is that it comes from God. No tenet lo omet. It gives you courage to believe in the possibility of rescue. There's no greater inclination towards evil than there is towards good. In Yanzeh, this is what we call the attribute of trust. With that, I'd like to turn to Rabbi Yandelman for a few minutes of question and conversation.
Great.
I'm going to take the screen off so that I can see more people.
So I got two versions of the same comment, one humorous and one serious. And I have to confess, I thought of this joke too that Tyval sent me about the joke about the flood, and there's the guy on top of the roof, and like I see nodding heads. They send a canoe and a motorboat and a helicopter, and he refuses all of them and says, God will save me. And then he's drowned, and and asks God in the afterlife, why didn't you save me? And God says, I sent a helicopter and a boat and a canoe, all that. And then the more serious phrasing of that came from Gary. This was in response, I think, to what your comment about some of what's happening in the Haredi community, that a theologian would argue that the medicine wouldn't exist without God.
I'm not sure I understand the import of the question. Maybe you can help me a bit, Rabbi Endelman.
That there's, I think that faith and trust doesn't need to imply a total helplessness. Right? That there's a role for us to play that perhaps is a manifestation of what God is trying to make happen in the world. How God is trying to determine our fate may involve a role for us.
Oh, that's if that's what the questioner intends, then I completely agree. And I think that's completely consistent with what we read in Maimuni and in the Hazonish, which is that you're supposed to take actions on your own behalf that are consistent with what we know about the natural world. And you exercise and you eat right and you take your medicine and so forth and so forth. But there are no guarantees. So you couple the fact that it's all in God's hands with the fact that you also have responsibility for yourself, because you don't know. Let me put it a different way, and summarize in one sentence what I think a fundamental teaching of the Book of Ecclesiastes is, which is that there is a God, there is a judgment. You have no idea what that judgment entails or what God is going to decide with respect to your fate, your ultimate fate. So don't worry about it. In other words, to be ignorant is also to be effectively free. You can say that God has predestined everything that's going to befall us, but if you don't know what it is, then you're effectively free. And I think that comes right out of the book of Kohelet. Don't worry about what you can't know. Worry about what you can know, and take actions accordingly. One of the remarkable things, if you were to compare the courses of action that Kohelet takes, that Ecclesiastes take during the book of Ecclesiastes, during the book, and contrast that with what we read about the course of action that the sufferer in the Babylonian Theodicy takes, a Babylonian poem, Babylonian poem about a sufferer who also thinks that his suffering, like Job's, is unjust. And he says, I've tried everything. I've even tried, moving people's boundaries and encroaching on people's territory and doing bad things and doing illegal things. Ecclesiastes never says that. Here's a guy, it's not clear what he believes is the relationship between right action and divine reward, or wrong action, divine punishment, because he just doesn't know. And he sees righteous people being cut off short, and he sees wicked people living long, fruitful lives, the end of Ecclesiastes chapter 8. But does that lead him to commend immorality? It's okay, God isn't going to do anything about it anyway. On the contrary, he lives a supremely moral life. He commends the moral life. He says there is going to be a judgment. He says that it's in God's hands, but you just don't know. So you're effectively free, but not free to breach the bounds of morality, which, at least as far as he seems to understand it, is pretty much guaranteed that that things will not go well with you. And it's a conundrum. It's a conundrum, and I acknowledge that. Sorry for that on 1 foot characterization of the book of Ecclesiastes, but let me boil it down again. Don't kill yourself trying to know what you can't know. know what you can know, and live a good life.
So maybe we can squeeze in one more in our last couple of minutes.
Sure.
There are a few questions about the mitzvot, responding to the last couple of sources you shared, and maybe you can share with us, based on those sources, based on the reality we live in, what you see as the role of mitzvot, and how it should play into the way we're relating to God. What are we trying to achieve? Does it connect to a certain faith, an uncertain faith, or is it all for a different purpose? On one foot.
I don't think it has much to do with fate at all. It's a great question. I thank you for asking it. And there's absolutely no reason I can't answer it in 3 minutes, right? But I would go right back to Rambam, right, who tells us, and he is followed in this by other authorities such as Ramban, Nachmanides, and Rabbeinu Bachya ben Asher, and others of my favorites. And that is to say that the mitzvot are graciously provided for us by God to enable us to do 3 things. One is, and he calls them to attain the attainment of perfection. And he calls the perfections shleimut hanefesh and shleimut haguf. When he says shleimut hanefesh, he means the achievement of our maximum intellectual potential. In other words, the study and pondering of the commandments, and the tremendous gifts that have come to us through our Jewish tradition enable us to achieve a kind of intellectual keenness. Now I've just doubled back right to those yeshiva students in the basement who are in fact doing that, trying to attain that kind of intellectual, spiritual perfection through the intense study of our tradition. And that's a good thing. And that's why the tradition exists, according to Rambam, at least in one interpretation. And the other perfection he calls shleimut haguf, perfection of the body, which does not mean going to all those closed exercise clubs again. It means body in the Aristotelian sense of the body politic. So his view of the mitzvot is that they enable us as individuals to attain the maximum of our human potential through study and observance. And they enable us to help perfect society through the ethics and morality and political values that they entail. And much of what he writes is an effort to demonstrate how the mitzvot, through our study of them and our observance of them, will enable us to attain self-perfection in the improvement of society. Now, that requires lots of interpretation and reinterpretation and reinterpretation. But I think for me, it's a core belief that the mitzvot are good for us and good for the world, and that it's an incredible act of divine grace to give us those mitzvot in order to help us to attain those 2 ultimate goals. And finally, through the study and observance of mitzvot, we can attain a glimmer of the mind of God. We can attain some kind of understanding and knowledge of God through this gracious gift, which is from God, an emanation of God. Just as the world comes from God, just as we come from God, so too the Torah comes from God, and the commandments come from God. And through them, we can attain some glimmer of knowledge of the divine source.
Thank you so much, Professor Cooper. What a perfect note to end on. I want to thank you on behalf of everyone. I've gotten so many comments for this. Your teaching was, needless to say, erudite, but also you walked us through a very complex and nuanced on the one hand, and also totally coherent exposition of this fact of uncertainty and how it need not paralyze us, but rather motivate us, how we act in the world. So thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
And I'm sorry to everyone whose questions I couldn't get to. There were so many wonderful questions and comments. But thank you for teaching us today. I hope everyone will join us next week. Our session next week is quite different, but will also be excellent, on trauma and testimony in an oversharing society. So this will be taught by our JTS fellow, Dr. Edna Friedberg, who's a historian at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. And the question of the session is about the public sharing of traumatic experiences, and how does that affect the experience? Is that a part of meaning making when it comes to the most difficult experiences of life? And we can certainly reflect on the relevance of that for what we're all going through, or what a lot of people are going through today with the pandemic. So I hope that you'll join us then. Again, thank you, Professor Cooper, and we hope to see all of you again soon.